West Coast Fire. I'm your host, Pastor Brian King, and with me this afternoon is my friend and fellow minister, the most right Reverend, Dr. Jeff Walker. Say hi to everybody,
Thanks,
Dr. Jeff.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in today. It's just Jeff, by the way, and glad to be with you, and hope we can bring something that's of encouragement to you.
Yeah, Jeff is really, I got to meet him when my son got engaged to his daughter, and so we're family, and it's been real good. I've gotten to know him a little bit, and he's such an interesting person. He is a doctor of psychology here in the Valley and has a practice, and we're going to have him back on the show probably in another month or so, and we're going to talk about some of the things, some of the places where psychology and faith intersect.
Yes.
You can do so much with psychology, you can do so much with faith, but when you put the two together with somebody like you that knows what they're doing, you can bring a lot of healing to a lot of people. So yeah. I want to have you back to talk
Thanks,
about
Brian.
that.
I'd love to come back. Absolutely.
Okay. So, but today, the reason that I asked, I'm just going to call him Jeff. Usually I refer to him as Dr. Walker, but we're going to just talk about, he's got a church here in the Valley in Rancho Mirage. It's Victory Christian Center. And it's over off of Bob Hope. He's been here for quite a while, and he's had the incredible pleasure and honor of having some real amazing men and women of God in that church. Today, he's had Oral Roberts has been there multiple times. He and Oral Roberts were very good friends. Oral Roberts, for those of you who are in my millennial following, Oral Roberts was one of the greatest faith healers of all time. And he was, if I recall right, the very first quote unquote televangelist.
Yeah, he brought he did. He brought the cameras he used to minister in a tent.
Right.
And they started bringing the TV cameras into the tent, watching the service, him preach and minister to the sick. Yeah.
Right. And then the thing that I really want to spend some time with Jeff about this morning is, Pastor Jeff, a lot of our audience is LGBT or allies of the LGBT community, and one of the icons of the LGBT community over the since in the past 2 decades was Tammy Faye Baker, who later was remarried and became Tammy Faye Mesner. And Tammy Faye was an amazing woman of faith, and Jeff had to me is just an immense privilege of being a really close friend and having her. She was his worship leader. And she was such an integral part of that church that if I recall, when Tammy Faye died, Westborough Baptist picketed you.
Right, we had a memorial service. They had one also in Carolina, I believe, but we had a memorial service here because she was part of the church, and we wanted to have a service, and so celebration of life. And of course, Roe was here and part of the church. Right. And
Mesner,
her husband after Jim. Yeah. And Westborough Baptist, I've been involved with the Sheriff's Department for many years as a reserve deputy and a chaplain. So the Sheriff's Department, a lieutenant called me in and he said, we have intel that Westborough Baptist is going to come picket your service when you have the memorial service for Tammy Faye. So he said, we'll be there, and so nothing will get out of hand. And they showed up in force, and Westborough showed up in force, and then the Metropolitan Community Church did a counter demonstration, and they made them separate. And I remember Rebecca took water bottles out because it seemed like it was in the summertime. And so Metropolitan Community, the gay community, all received the water, and then Becca took water to the Westborough Baptist, and they didn't want your water because we're all going to hell. And
they didn't want your liberal
demon water.
Yeah. Oh, so you've been called a liberal. You know what it's like to be on that side. That's a bad word for a lot of people.
I just want to be like Jesus. I don't know about tags.
I agree. I agree so much, and I wish we could do away with all of them. I've got a book coming out. I know you know that.
I heard you. Yeah.
Yeah, and every place that I've referenced the LGBT community, my editor came back and said that's not acceptable anymore. It's either got to be LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus. Right. And I'm like, okay, we'll do what we need to do. But I just wish we could drop all of the labels.
Sure.
But you had started to tell me about your beginnings, and Just give us, if you would, we've got some time. I want to talk about how did you end up with Tammy Faye Baker as your worship leader, and what was that like? Because she was so over the top. I remember when her and Jim were on back in the old days when I was in my early 20s. And I remember seeing, I was always into high fashion and that, and I remember seeing her sitting there in about a $5,000 suit with about a $250,000 ring on, crying because the donations weren't coming in, quickly enough. And I was very critical of her back then. I was not born again. I was, like I said, in my early 20s, and I remember just loathing her. And the tears, I always thought they were false tears.
Yeah.
And then I met someone who's very good friends of hers and said, I've never seen a woman who cried more in my life. And that's a personal friend of yours as
Right.
well. And and I'm like, oh, those were real. He's like, oh my God, yes. He said she would weep over everything.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, well, that's cool, because when she went through the cancer, and she took such a strong stand toward the LGBT community, I think she melted. A lot of my people have hearts of stone and hearts of ice, but she melted them. I mean, like nobody I've ever seen. And when she died, my whole community mourned.
Yeah.
But tell us about her and your experience with her and how all this came to be.
Okay. Well, I grew up watching Jim and Tammy. I grew up in the Midwest. We didn't get the other Christian networks where I grew up. We did get PTL and Jim and Tammy. So I just grew up watching her and, wondering about the tear, all the same thing. But I appreciated them, and I really appreciated the whole concept of the family theme park and all that, where people could come and enjoy the water park and the camping and all that, the hotel. Thought it was something first class for the Christian community. So I grew up watching them, and I moved here, started pastoring, and then they bought a home here, and there's a lot of turmoil back in some of the 80s, and I don't remember the years, but Jim and Tammy used to come to church, and then, of course, they went separate ways, and Jim ended up in prison. And then Tammy remarried Roe Messner, as you mentioned, and they started coming to church. And
that's when they had relocated here to, was it Palm Springs or was it Rancho Mirage? In the valley.
Rancho Mirage, yeah, Rancho Mirage. So, but they started coming to church. I ran into Tammy Faye after she had married Roe Messner, and she was coming out of Marie Callender's, and I said, well, hey, how are you? And she said, oh, I'm good. And I said, well, I haven't seen you at church. And she said, no, I'm going to another church because I'm divorced. I couldn't come to your church because I'm divorced. And I said, well, Tammy, half the church is divorced. That has nothing to do with anything. Please come to church. And so that following Sunday, she came to church and with Roe, and people just loved her and were kind to her, and she to them.
Praise God.
I've never seen Tammy Faye be unkind to any human being. Her acceptance of people as people, we're just people, was unconditional and unwavering. Pardon me. So they started coming to church, and then after a while, then Roe ended up going to prison for a couple of years as well. I don't know if you were aware of that.
Yeah, I've read her book. So
yeah, so he, I think it was 28 months to federal prison over in L.A. During that time, I asked her if she would be our choir director. She wasn't actually the worship leader, but choir director.
Oh, okay.
She played the organ, lead the choir, and I'll have to tell you, the choir had a great time because, you're thinking, I'm part of the choir, and Tammy Faye's our choir director.
Yeah.
Tourists would come visit the church, of course, in the wintertime here, and you'd see them pointing and whispering and recognizing that it was Tammy Faye. Yeah. Some people loved it, and some people hated it because maybe their frame of reference was negative of her.
Right.
But overall, people loved her, and she loved them. She loved that choir. She loved the choir, and just had a great time. And you want to talk about the funeral?
Yeah. Tell me, I've got a couple stories. of Tammy Faye that I'm
Go
going to
ahead.
share with you. Well, my first one is, you know, I told you in my early 20s where I was with her, and then about my mid 20s, right about the time, I'd say within a year after, I guess April was 26, so mid right around there, 26, 27. A very close friend of mine was working in Orlando at the big promenade that had just opened there, and Tammy Faye came in, and as fate would have it, he worked at a very, very, very high-end makeup counter, and she walked by, and my friend, gay man, made a bitchy comment, and he goes, he said he thought he was muttering it under his breath, says she looks like a whore. Well, he said it out loud, and Tammy stopped in her tracks, and she goes over and leans to the counter. She goes, "Did you just call me a whore?" And he said, "No, ma'am. I said you look like one." And she said, "Do you know who I am?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am, I do, and you look like a whore." And she said, "Well," she sat down up in the makeup chair and said, "What would you do differently?" And so he started, she goes, "Don't touch the eyelashes." So he took it all off, did her makeup the way he thought it should be done. She looked at it and she goes, "Very nice job, but it's not me. Now put it back." They became the best of friends, and he went on to be vice president of Guerlain of Paris.
Wow.
And he would fly in just to have dinner with Tammy.
Nice.
So that was, as far as I know, the first openly gay man that she developed a relationship with, and this was back in the late 70s,
Yeah.
I guess late 70s, early 80s. So that was, and of course that got through my little circle, that David had met Tammy Faye Baker, and that she was actually a really nice person.
Yeah.
And that's when the perception started to change in the LGBT community,
Yeah.
because word gets around.
Yeah.
But so tell me about the funeral, and what was it like to have Westborough Baptist picketing you?
Yeah, that was an interesting, you know, again, I grew up in a small town in the cornfields of Illinois. Westborough Baptist was the last thing on my radar, you know, or having Tammy Faye in my church or any of that. Pardon me. So we had her memorial service. They had one back in North Carolina, I believe, and then we had a memorial service here because Roe was in the church, and my church people wanted to have a memorial service because they loved her.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the police department called me and they said, "We understand. We want to let you know that the Westborough Baptist Church is going to come picket this service of yours." And so they came and they put American flags on the ground and stood on them and held signs of a picture of Tammy Faye surrounded in flames. And their sign said Tammy Faye's in hell and negative things about the church. And, you know, they're just anti. They have nothing. I heard one person say, if it doesn't sound like good news, it's not the gospel. The gospel means good news. They're just not good news people in any shape or form. So there they were, and the sheriff's department sent out several officers, deputies, police officers, to make sure nothing happened. Then Metropolitan Community Church also gathered in support of Tammy Faye, and it was it was a interesting moment, but the church was filled with many, in fact, a lot of gay people started coming to my church at that point because they came and felt welcome.
Right.
And so I remember the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church still now attends occasionally, former pastor. Anyway, it was just an interesting moment, and to see kind of who was going to be loving and who was going to be hateful. And
Right.
My daughter took bottles of water. It was kind of a hot evening, and she took water bottles out to the Metropolitan Community congregation, which of course they received it and were grateful. And then she tried to take water to the Westborough Baptist picketers, and they said, "We don't want your water, your false doctrine, whatever." They just had negative things to say about the church and about her, and get away. We don't want your demon water kind of thing. It was kind of crazy.
I think I told you the other night when we were talking that I saw a meme on Facebook that said, live your life with such utter passion that Westborough Baptist Church pickets your funeral. And
well said.
yeah, and that's actually one of my goals, because my book is going to upset a lot of people. Because I call some things out. In my book, I call out the Christian church, the mainstream of Christian church, for where they've missed the boat with this. And I also call out the affirming church for where they've gone so far into making sure everybody felt inclusive that they've negated the gospel. The church isn't supposed to be a social club. I don't believe it's a long-term care facility either. I think people say church is a hospital. If it is, it's a triage.
Yeah.
It's get people in, get them well,
Yeah.
and help them to live a victorious life.
Absolutely.
Not coddle and pamper them in their brokenness.
Absolutely.
Jesus never looked at somebody and said, wow, I hope you get well. He healed them and then said, now let's do something.
Yeah.
Let's do something with your life.
Yeah, take up your bed and walk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't let people carry you around the rest of your life.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. So that's the way I feel about it. But I did want to share with everybody, we've got plenty of time. I want to share my favorite story that I've ever heard about Tammy Faye, because a lot of people don't realize that, Tammy Faye was very warmly received by the LGBT community, but she never, ever, ever compromised her witness.
Sure.
And this was told by somebody who is a very dear friend of mine, who actually got to be very close friends with her in the latter years of her life, and actually interviewed her for a book that has not been written yet, but will be coming out. And he tells this story. He said I guess she was staying for a period. I don't know if it was a couple of weeks or whatever, but she was in Long Beach with friends, and he was living in Long Beach at the time. And he said Tammy called him one night about 10 o'clock, and she said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm getting ready for bed." She goes, "Well, don't." She goes, "Get ready. We're going out." She said, "The car will be there to pick you up at 11." And he said, "Okay." 11 o'clock on a Friday night, Saturday night, it was one of the two, it was a weekend. He said, "Okay." So he said, "Well, where are we going?" She said, "Don't worry about it, just be ready." So the car pulls up, she's got a driver, and she's in, and he gets in. She doesn't tell him where they're going. Well, she takes him downtown to a drag bar, and he goes in with her. He goes, "Okay, so I'm in a drag bar with Tammy Faye Baker, Mesner." And he said, she told him, she goes, "You're going to love it, you're going to love it, I promise you." And he's like thinking, "I'm not really sure I am." But because he had no idea what was going to go on. He said, so she goes over and she says, "The owner is a really dear friend of mine, Tammy Faye, the owner of a drag bar, dear friend." So she goes over to the owner and says hi, and she goes, she goes, "Would you let me have 2 minutes at midnight just to say hi to all the boys?" And he said, "Oh, absolutely." He said, so midnight comes, all the house lights go on. And if I don't know about your past, if you've ever had a bar pass, but you don't want the lights coming on at midnight. That's just not cool. But he said all the lights came on, and the owner of the bar got up. They had a stage because it was for drag performances, and he gets up on the stage and he goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have a very dear friend of mine tonight is here," and the spotlights hit her, and the crowd goes nuts. And he said, "She'd like to say a few words. Would y'all mind if she takes the stage for a moment?" Well, that was at midnight. Tammy got up there. They asked her to sing. She sang the gospel song. They asked her to do an encore. He said she sang 3 or 4 songs. Ended up preaching. Said at 4 o'clock in the morning, they left there. He
Wow.
said, and when they left, every single person that was in the bar had come forward for her to pray with them. He said there were men on their knees, weeping, praying in tongues. He said people got saved, people got healed, and people got filled with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
On the floor and on the platform of a drag bar in Long Beach,
I
California.
believe every word of that.
And he said he was literally numb. He gets in the car. Tammy gets in after him. They put him in first. Tammy gets in after him because she's waving goodbye to all the guys. And she looks at him and she goes, "And that's the way I roll." And he said that's all she said.
Yeah.
But he said it was the most amazing thing that he's ever seen in his
Yeah.
life. He's never seen anybody more genuinely compassionate for people and love people any more than she did.
Yeah.
And he said there's not a lot of people I can tell this story to, but you know, she had this anointing about her. She had a mantle that no one else has ever seen before. She was flamboyant, and she was friends with RuPaul, the drag queen.
Right.
And Ru had her on his show,
right.
And just I've never seen anybody else that could, you know, the word says the word to be in the world but not of
Right.
it, and she could literally walk through a pigsty,
Yep.
and come out with nothing on
Yeah.
her.
Yeah,
She was an amazing
absolutely,
person.
absolutely. It's just like Jesus. He wasn't. You know, the Pharisees were always concerned about who Jesus was with, and they were, you know, always complaining. And he just welcomed people, and they felt safe with Jesus. The most wounded, hurting people drew themselves to Jesus to hear what he had to say. So I think I was just meditating on that passage one time, Luke 15, verse 1, and the Holy Spirit visited me in a profound way. I mean, it was one of those moments where just, I don't even know how long it lasted, but that verse is branded in my heart, that Jesus allowed the most broken to be with him and to feel safe with him. They wanted to hear what he had to say, and so I was just in my mind having this dialogue with God. Lord, that's not a picture of the church. You know, we don't make people feel safe in our presence. We push them away with whether it's spoken or unspoken, with our attitude or our demeanor, our presence, our body language, our facial expressions. And I think it's important that we become like Jesus, so that people, no matter who they are, where they're from, what's going on in their world, they feel safe. They feel safe and welcome. I love Brendan Manning's kind of famous statement, the Lord loves us as we are and not as we should be.
Amen.
For none of us are as we should be.
No, amen.
Yeah, so
that's absolutely true. So do you have any other stories of when she was with you and something that happened, or her ministering, you know?
we took a staff retreat when she was on staff to Hawaii, and I remember Melissa and I were.
I wish I'd been part of your church.
we had it was kind of a good days for the church, and so we did this staff retreat, and I think there were a dozen of us probably, and she went with us, of course. And we, my wife at the time, my ex-wife and I, were going to go walk on the beach, and so we asked her to go with us, and she wore her high heels on the beach because she couldn't really walk without her heels. She was she was so accustomed to that.
That's too funny.
Anytime anyone ever approached her, and like you said, even if they said something a little snide, she was gracious. She was just kind, always, to everyone. And I think that's the thing that stands out about. I gave her. She'd never ridden on a motorcycle, and I've had a Harley at the time. So I have the video somewhere. I'd love to share it with you.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Her first ride on a motorcycle, and so just lots of good memories. And we went one time. She was taping cooking shows in Houston for whatever reason. We went down there, and she and Ro were taping.
I remember that was in her book, and I think they even covered it in the movie, because RuPaul did a movie about her life, or RuPaul narrated. I think they covered the cooking show in there.
Yeah, so just lots of sweet memories.
Tammy was one of those people that was just made for the spotlight.
Yeah.
It just followed her everywhere she went, and she thrived in it.
Yeah, there was just a grace on her to be unflustered by whatever was going on. She was even keeled, just chill in the middle of all of it. If it was good or if it was bad, of course she would become tearful, but she didn't lose, she hung in there, and I'm so grateful to have known her.
I think for the type of person I am, that after I found out that that's who she was, when I have seen old clips and she's crying, it instead of irritating me, it endeared her to me even more. Yeah. Because I knew she was just that passionate a person, and that compassionate a person.
Yeah.
every now and then a celebrity will die, and you'll hear the phrase that, you know, we lost a star, a bright star with that one. That was a point of light. We definitely lost a point of light when she died.
Yeah.
You could tell. Sorry, guys. Maybe this is why I relate to her. It's something that I picked up recently. But Pastor Jeff, I want to thank you for coming today.
Yeah, it's good to be
maybe
here,
another time when you come, I'd like to have you a couple times. I'd like to talk about psychology and faith together, and maybe talk about healing and the healing anointing and your relationship with Oral Roberts. I would just want to thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Bless you, man. It's been awesome.
Thank you all.
And for those of you watching and listening, I know, you know, we get more watches on YouTube and more listens on YouTube, but we're on Spotify, Google, Apple Music, and all the other stuff. Y'all check us out there and follow us. But for those of you listening, this is Pastor Brian King with West Coast Fire, wishing you the blessing of shalom. May there be nothing missing, nothing broken in your life. I love you all. Goodbye.